I'm joined by our visiting scholar, Dr. Stephen Willing. We're talking about critical thinking, we're talking about Christian character and ways that we can improve our thinking. Stephen, in logic, we have a fallacy known as the appeal to the people. The Latin is the ad populum fallacy. One version is called the bandwagon fallacy. Everybody's doing it, so you should too. I tried to use that on my dad when I was a teenager. It didn't go over all that well. But what do you mean by this interesting expression, distrusting the herd?
Oh, there are so many ways we could go with this, Ken. C.S. Lewis came up with the expression presentism, which is a conceit that our generation, of all the generations in all the history of humanity, is the one that finally got everything figured out, all the transcendent questions, how to live our lives, the perfect morals. And he said every generation experiences that, and every generation has been blind to their own faults. Likewise, future generations will look back upon us and say, how could they have possibly believed those things or done those things? Now, by Myers-Briggs, I come out as an INTJ, and unfortunately, we're famously known for being nonconformists and not being that interested in the approval or acceptance of others. So I've always been a little bit of an oddball in that regard. But that's not normative. Most people are a lot better socialized than me and really want to be accepted and approved and be popular, and that usually means agreeing with the crowd. There are plenty of examples in history where the right cause was a minority viewpoint, and where the heroes had to stand up to majority. I mean, Jesus had to stand up to the authorities of ancient Jerusalem. Martin Luther had to stand up to the Catholic Church. John Adams had to stand up to the British monarchy. Martin Luther King had to stand up to the entrenched social structures of his era. Every one of those faced majorities at some point, and every one of them had to face them down. It takes independence, it takes courage, it takes a certain amount of healthy skepticism, like we talked about in an earlier podcast. There's nothing wrong with, and sometimes the majority is right. Sometimes there's nothing wrong inherently with going along with the crowd, but it should never be a reason for believing anything or doing anything.
So again, the idea here is, Lewis talked about chronological snobbery, where there is this tendency to think that everything in the present is right, and everything in the past is kind of substandard. But recognizing that there is a herd mentality at times. Of course, it may be a consensus that's worthy of our consideration, but it may also be true that we have to consider alternatives that are not popular. And could that not be a healthy corrective to our way of thinking?
I think the best safeguard is the anchor that's provided by Scripture. Now, people can and do argue over proper interpretations of various verses, but Scripture serves as a good anchor. Something that is wildly out of sync with what Scripture clearly teaches is something that should be looked upon with great suspicion, regardless of how the majority may feel about it. It's not unique to our generation, I don't believe. I believe it's been present in past generations as well. Now, we can't necessarily construct an entire way of living based on Scripture alone. We talked about the pursuit of wisdom and how we need to grow in our knowledge and understanding. And Scripture is a beginning, but it also serves it as an anchor. It keeps us anchored to one basic truth, but gives us a long anchor cord. It gives us a lot of room to move around, but it keeps us from becoming unmoored and completely floating off into some far-off tangent of unreality.
It seems that distrusting the herd gets at the idea that often it's easy to go with the herd, to go with what is the consensus position or the majority point of view, but to think critically and to think reflectively is to kind of slow down and to be deliberate and to consider options that are not as popular. And so that's kind of, again, a healthy mindset, if you will.
Yes, and this may be the hardest time in the history of humanity to push against the herd, because with social media, with Twitter, with Facebook, with the hyper-judgmental morality, moralizing of current society, there may have never been a point in history where it was more dangerous or where you are more exposed to express a dissenting viewpoint.